In her book, Dare to Lead, Brené Brown describes shame as the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love, belonging, and connection. Where there is shame, there is no empathy, and vice versa. In today's episode, I have invited the lovely Stephanie Jeans, a psychotherapist specialized in sex addiction, to unpack the topic of shame and compulsive behavior and how they manifest in the clients she supports. Together, we will discuss how leaders can support employees struggling with compulsive behavior and how a little bit of empathy and hope can make a big impact. This is E3. Engage and empower with empathy. Welcome to the show today, Stephanie. It's really lovely to have you here. I understand you are logging in today from South Africa, so thank you for joining us from afar.
It's such a pleasure to be here, Rebecca. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. I don't even know where to start with this because it's such a fascinating topic. I've interviewed quite a few psychotherapists for this podcast because what we're bringing to the workplace is our whole selves, and that includes whatever baggage that we're bringing from childhood. And I've learned from talking to psychotherapists how much that mental health piece in the workplace is so important. So we'll get to that in a bit, but let's talk a little bit about your specialty, which is sex addiction. How did you come to specialize in this?
Yeah, no, good question. It just sort of unfolded over time. So being a generalized practitioner, I started out with bereavement really as my specialism. But then I became quite curious because I noticed a lot of clients were coming with sexual dysfunction, for example, that couldn't be explained in psychosexual terms or a physical problem or anything like that. They were talking about compulsive behaviors online, like with pornography, etc. But it was so shaming. It was so difficult initially for them to open up that I thought, okay, if this is more and more a thing, as it seems to be, especially with our digital age and the internet and everything online, then if I know more about this, then I can help facilitate someone being able to speak much more easily on the topic. So I studied it and I became more and more curious. So I know you've spoken with the idea of Brené Brown and her idea of shame, which I know is of interest to you. And she talks, of course, about this human connectivity that we're all trying to have. But somehow the shame that drives us means we're not connected with people. The curiosity came as I was thinking, okay, we're more connected online than ever, but somehow not in real terms with people around us. And so we then are seeking community, but not quite sure how to get it. And then we get drawn into online forums or chats that fuel violence and misogyny and sexualized behaviors. So if you think about someone who's struggling with a sex addiction, fighting a compulsivity, so that's the person who their mind is sort of consumed by sexual thoughts, urges, wants, everything around them. And consequently, it affects and impacts their day-to-day responsibilities and what they need to do because it's taking this emotional bandwidth all of the time, like any addiction does, because you need to get your need met. So it became a question of, okay, what is this relationship with unhealthy sexual behaviors? Sex is meant to be a normal driver to procreate, just like we need food to survive, but food becomes complex for someone with an eating disorder. How does sex become a behavior that is not feeling good anymore? And alongside that, then seeking to recognize if somebody's doing things that are clashing with their moral compass, with their authentic selves, when they're not liking themselves because of the behavior, it so follows there's increased levels of anxiety, of feeling stress, of not feeling good about themselves, and a self-loathing, which is where the shame comes in. And then you would think that sex, we all talk about sex, we all talk about mental health because everywhere you look, every advert, every TV program, all of it includes it. But yet we're not talking about what lies beneath. We're not talking about what a lonely place it can be, what a sad place it can be, what a disconnected place it can be. And therefore, the more you feel like that, the more alone, the more you're going to go online to find that community. So, noting the gap in the market, where if you can just help one person to reduce the stigma and the taboo and the shame who can be helped, that then has a knock on effect with everyone in their world and in the community, it's worth it. And sad to say, since I did do the specialization, it's just sort of overtaken the majority of my work. It's just such a massive growing problem.
I was actually talking to my husband this morning because I mentioned I was having this interview and he was curious about the topic, and we were both wondering, because obviously there are many types of addictions out there. So what would fuel someone to end up, rather than gambling or smoking too much or, all the many other addictions out there, what leads someone to go down that path of sex addiction? Like, why are you now fully specialized in this? And that's basically your full-time job. Why are you seeing this uptick? Like, is just addiction in general becoming more of an issue? Or is this particular addiction, advent of the internet and the digital age, becoming more of a challenge?
Yeah, all of the above that you've just said there. Just to say that oftentimes one addiction runs alongside another. So somebody might be drinking too much that then leads them to lose their inhibitions and go online or go into chat rooms, etc. So they can go alongside. Why has sex become yet a problematic behavior? I do put so much down to our digital world and online. If I think of the youth, anyone up to 30 years old plus has just grown up with the internet. So what happens is that people are exposed to things way before their young minds are able to take it on board. And they're either being shown, let's say, pornography by a big brother, or it's passed around at school, or something just innocuously pops up in the algorithms that then intensify. And it just becomes sort of almost second nature, and people become desensitized to it. They need to see more of something to get that sexual arousal. So if you take a young person entering puberty and they're getting dopamine hits, the pleasure centers of their brain, just literally a click or two away, and then their phones are flooded with things like with violence, with misogynistic things, you get drawn into it. And so before you know, it becomes a problem. And then when we talk about the taboo of something, even if you think of the sex education in schools, and I like to think it's improving, everyone's talking about don't get an STD or don't fall pregnant but who is talking about how pornography, for example, can become problematic? And throw in for someone who is already vulnerable. Okay, so let's say someone who's had adverse childhood experiences such as neglect or abuse. They feel lacking in confidence and esteem. They can turn online where they get drawn into certain things. So, for example, there's a big problem around something called the com, which is a platform that goes onto encrypted sort of such as on social media or gaming platforms like Discord. And they're targeting young people, young boys specifically from about 11 onwards, who are unsure of who and what they are, and teaching them what it is to be a man. And that involves sexual stuff. And it's horrific. And we think we know what our children are doing, but we don't. We think they're safe because they're in the bedroom upstairs. And this group, for instance, encourage entry-level behaviors to qualify, and then you have to do more and more stuff like drink their own urine, cut their hair off and eat it, self-harm, sexually molest their sisters or their classmates, enact violence towards animals and others. So in Britain here, the National Crime Agency is working very hard to try to shut it down, and working with the US government, New Zealand, the Philippines, France, for example. But that vulnerability of people, and they get drawn into the different things like the incel movement, whereby those are young men who are virgins, who have never had sex, and they are encouraged to hate women for it. It's women's fault. They're intimidating. They're not nice. So that hatred sort of infiltrates. And at the moment on Netflix, it's very new, there's a program called Adolescence. And it's very harrowing, and it's of a young 13-year-old boy who killed a classmate, a female. And on the surface of it, they've done it very cleverly. He hasn't come from the typical dysfunctional home, broken home, or an alcoholic parent or abuse, normal home, whatever normal constitutes. And as the program goes along, you realize he was teased, he was called an incel, he was bullied, he got drawn into things like Andrew Tate and how women should be. And the anger that gets fueled in somebody means they turn that anger outwards. They have to do something within, so they target those in their orbit. So that's how it can grow. So seeds get planted, it grows, and our online world, everyone is just targeted, and some withstand, but others don't if they are struggling. There's a big link, for instance, people who are neurodiverse, for instance, who struggle with communication skills and reading body language and really want friends, but don't quite know how to get there. They're incredibly vulnerable to being targeted and groomed. So yeah, underlying vulnerabilities, time on the internet, being exposed to things way too early, and adverse childhood conditions that then get reinforced over time.
You were mentioning how in society we see, talk about mental health. We're talking about sex, but we're not quite digging deep enough to the root cause. And I'm just wondering if this is where empathy as a society needs to come into play and really tune into that deep-rooted sense of isolation or I'm not good enough. And Brene actually talks about this a lot in her book Dare to Lead, about the I'm not good enough, I'm just not enough. Like that is your mentality when you are feeling shame. So let's talk about that a little bit more, because I'm sure you experience this with your clients. She actually defines empathy as connecting to the emotions that underpin the experience. And I thought it would make sense to just read a passage from that chapter rather than try to just paraphrase it myself, because she says it so eloquently. But she says, shame is not a compass for moral behavior. It's much more likely to drive destructive, hurtful, immoral, and self-aggrandizing behavior than it is to heal it. Why? Because where shame exists, empathy is almost always absent. That's what makes shame dangerous. The opposite of experiencing shame is experiencing empathy. The behavior that many of us find so egregious today is more about people being empathyless, not shameless. Tell me a little bit more about your experience working with clients, and does this, what Brene is saying, does this resonate with you and what you're seeing in your clients, and how do you help them replace that shame that's probably really deep in their DNA? How do you replace that with empathy over time? And how can we as a society reach out to these people? Obviously, it's wonderful that we have psychotherapists like you, but how can we be more empathetic to what might be going on behind closed doors and what might be really impacting people in a negative way? How can we lend a helping hand?
Yeah, Brené Brown, of course, being absolute guru on the idea of shame and that lack of connectedness with self that can feel good about ourselves. So if someone has good self-esteem, good confidence. They're always things that we battle with, but generally feels a positive sense of regard. They're not hurting in the same way that leads us to hurt other people. A bully has been bullied in one form or another. We need to make ourselves feel better by lashing out at others. So if we don't like ourselves, we don't have empathy for self, it's very hard to engage with people around us in a kind, positive manner. I would say with shame, we all carry it. A little bit is no bad thing, simply because it acts a bit like a moral compass and tries to keep us on the straight and narrow. But too much shame is so weighty. So if you think of that standardized thing that someone says to a kid, that word disappointment is such a small word in a sense, but it's the one I think I hate more than most words in our language, because that sense of, I'm so disappointed in you. You've not only let me down, you've let yourself down, and you can just feel a person getting heavier and heavier. The eye contact goes, I just need to be small and not be seen, because to be seen is just not nice. And the person who doesn't want to be seen, how do they cope with those unimaginable feelings for a human being? Again, that drives the behavior that I was talking about a moment ago. So yeah, how do you help someone with that? Anything, you need to shine a spotlight on it, because it's a bit like, the kid with the monster under the bed, and mum comes along and looks with you. Oh, it's okay, it's a pair of socks, it's not really a monster. So bringing something out makes it more bearable, but it has to be done in as non-judgmental a fashion as possible. Now, to clarify what I mean by that, it's like any bad behavior. You challenge the bad behavior. Okay, what you're doing is not okay, but you're okay. You, the human being, are okay, but what you're doing is not. So let's try and separate out those two things. So that's what I mean by a non-judgment. As a psychotherapist, believe me, Rebecca, sometimes you're sitting there going, you're joking. Really? That's not on. And how do you relay that without the person shutting down? Because remember, the person who's feeling that shame is judging themselves more than anybody else. And I'm talking generally, you will come across people who do not have any remorse, who do not see a problem in their behavior. Let's say someone with psychopathic tendencies, for instance. So even in my practice, there are limitations as to what or who I can work with. And it would very quickly become apparent at the beginning that there isn't accountability. But where there is, then you can work with that accountability. And it's very interesting. Sometimes when a client comes to me for therapy, it's because they've been caught by their partner, or even I work with offenders, those who've crossed a line and the police have knocked on the door. They can often say to me, this is the worst thing in the world that's happened to me, but it's strange. There's a sense of relief that I'm feeling because it's out there. And they're not carrying around the burden of the secrecy. And that's often the killer for somebody with any addictive behaviors. It's the lies and the secrecy that reinforce the feelings that somebody has. So in working with someone, you try and unpick that. You do the psychotherapy. Where are the roots of this behavior? So obviously opportunity, we all have that. But often trauma issues, attachment issues. Then you work with the day-to-day stresses that somebody has, because if someone's undergoing a disciplinary at work, or they missed out on a promotion, for example, or their partner's really annoyed, or their marriage is broken down, or anything going on, or they suffered a bereavement, that's going to lead them to the behavior that is self-soothing or escapist and so on. And then, of course, you can bring in certain tools and strategies to try to work to put a healthier, different behavior in place rather than the addictive behavior that's doing harm to them and to others.
Yeah, it's interesting because you mentioned how this behavior impacts performance at work, a missed promotion or whatever example you want to give. And I'm seeing mental health in the workplace. It's becoming more and more of an issue, and human resources departments are bringing it on, looking at tools that they can provide leaders to help the employees that they lead. But my general feeling is that many leaders don't even know where to start with mental health. It's almost like this really sensitive topic that they wouldn't even know how to approach someone who reports to them about mental health because, I don't want to cross any sensitive lines. If someone's struggling on my team, like, how do I even approach that topic in a way that wouldn't be offensive or yeah, cross any lines that aren't supposed to be crossed? What would you advise for someone leading a team, and maybe there's someone with visibly compulsive behavior or someone who's struggling? Where would you even start if you're not a psychotherapist? Because I don't think that's the job of leaders in the workplace to
No, no,
replace you,
no.
right? But they need to be able to have those conversations with employees to help them and reach out in some way. But where do they start?
It's very difficult, isn't it? Because it comes back to the taboo, and you don't want to be too personal with somebody. So I guess some of it is early intervention and noticing what's going on. So if you consider what happens, let's say, with somebody at work if they're struggling, um, because, like I said, there's not the same emotional bandwidth. So take the example of somebody working from home and they've got two computer screens, and the one computer screen is just streaming pornography all day long. Take the long haul truck driver, for instance. There was a case in the UK in 2017 of a truck driver killed somebody on the motorway because he was driving with these tons of metal of this truck that he was in control of, but he had pornography streaming on his phone. So he wasn't paying attention to the road and killed somebody. So with those things going on, that colleague of yours that you notice, that person under you, will often be very irritable or very anxious. You might notice that they are not getting on with colleagues very well. They may be procrastinating. They may be missing deadlines, for instance. They are affecting the company with, let's say, customers, clients, stakeholders, losing trust in the company and their professionalism because the person they're dealing with is not coming back to them or doing the job they're meant to do. They may notice things like the person is harassing female colleagues, for example, or objectifying them. There may be noticeable absenteeism. So, for instance, a person's just checked out and they're not coming to work, or they're emotionally checked out and not on it, and citing mental health. Literally, this morning, I read an article in the paper that within the UK, a fifth of people who are eligible of age to be in the workplace, a fifth are not, and they are not actively seeking work. And that's up to sort of age 25-ish, 18 to 25. And
Hmm.
most of them are citing poor mental health. So productivity countrywide, never mind company-wide, is going to fall. So the manager who is proactive, who's noticing there's something off and tries to provide a confidential space. It's very difficult because you've got to trust your manager. You've got to know it's not going to go any further. And coming back to the taboo of a subject like this, if you were drinking too much or you were taking drugs or gambling, it's much more socially acceptable. as opposed to this just becomes an excuse for bad behavior. But having good employee-assisted programs in place that people can go for therapy to allow flexible working hours so somebody can attend therapy or go and see their doctor or join an SAA group, which is Sex Addicts Anonymous, which works like Alcoholics Anonymous, for example. Um, and just bringing in wellness programs, if we're talking how people's well-being is affected, exercise programs and drives, mindfulness or stress reduction workshops. A lot of clients will say to me, my company's great at talking about mental health and we're here to listen, but actually they're not actually walking the walk of the talk, as it were. And so how to make it sort of accessible to people. I think you're exactly right, Rebecca. It's not the responsibility of managers to be on it in all things like that. They're running a business, there's a job to do, and you need to deliver. So there's a balance of accountability alongside, okay, I understand you're going through a tough time, but you still have to do your job. If you can't do your job, okay, what can we do to help you? And encouraging that open dialogue and educating themselves as much as possible. I guess bringing in HR or occupational health and opening up forums for discussion in ways that feel safe for an employee to do. But it's not an easy black and white response, especially when at the end of the day, the business needs to make money, whether it's got 3 employees or 500,000, you need someone to earn their salary. So how to do it in a way that the person feels they can approach their manager. And when the wheels come off somehow, to be able to speak with a bit of honesty about why they're in such a predicament, what's actually going on for them. But the more our wider media, etc., can be talking about these things, then of course it reduces that stigma and opens up conversation. And that's all we can really be doing, is as best as possible open up dialogue and not be ashamed to talk about these things.
Yeah, I mean, it worries me too, and you referenced this a little bit with the younger generation. They're obviously the future leaders in the workplace, and they're such high anxiety generation. How should leaders address this cohort coming into the workplace that is so high strung with anxiety, and to your point, grew up with the digital age and know nothing else, and have as a result self-isolated in a way, by using social media and other platforms as a way of communicating and connecting versus the in-person contact that the older generations benefited from. How can we help Gen Z?
I have clients that range from teenagers through to pensioners, and when you come across these different mindsets and work ethics and views on mental health, it's so difficult because I totally empathize with both sides. And how do you meet in the middle? So I have an older manager, let's say in their 50s, or going, "Oh, just don't get this younger generation and they're so work shy," or I've overloaded them or expected them to work after hours, but it's too much for them and they can't do it, and they won't come into the workplace. They need to work from home, and so they get very, very frustrated. And then at the other spectrum, you do have these young people, let's say they're on a graduate scheme or apprenticeship program, and going, "But I'm not coping in this," or "I don't feel this is fair," or "the pressure or expectation," or "that's not what I signed up for," or "no one seems to understand," and "the competition here is just too much," and all this ambition. And so they're withdrawing and shutting down because they're not feeling understood. So how you meet in the middle is very difficult. But again, that just comes back to dialogue. Even having, I don't know, workshops where Gen Z with those older, for example, open up and try and meet in the middle somewhere. So as human beings, we need to negotiate with each other. We don't always have to get the other person's point. Sometimes we can agree to disagree, but to try to get onto the other person's island, whatever that might look like. Because at the end of the day, if you do, you're going to get more out of that person. They're going to cooperate better. They're going to be more motivated. They're going to want to please. They're going to want to do a good job. So the manager who can really connect with the younger person can feel good about being a mentor and guiding and helping. And the young person can feel safe with an older manager, that they can explore their frustrations without being judged for being work shy or a snowflake, as everyone likes to use that term. But it just means we're all missing each other all the way along. And that's what we need to sort of reduce that gap in thinking and mentality as best we can.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point, and that's reflected in society in general right now. Is just we're not listening to each other. We're becoming increasingly polarized, and we're not willing to use empathy to truly step in the shoes of the other side and try to understand where they're coming from. It goes beyond the young generation. It's just everyone.
It does. I absolutely agree. I can also make the point, which maybe is also not that popular. There is some thinking as well about we are making normal challenges, stresses into a mental health issue. We all have mental health like we have physical. And sometimes it is a case of you need to build your resilience. You need to build your ability to combat stress. Sometimes you just need to batten down the hatches and get on with something.
Absolutely. And your point about absenteeism is a really interesting one, because I think to me that's a red flag that we probably need to work on leadership skills and coaching skills and ensuring that employees feel seen and heard. Because if they're just clocking out all the time, then they probably don't feel seen and heard. And it's not necessarily a deep-rooted mental health issue that's causing them to just clock out every month. Well, this was certainly an enriching dialogue, Stephanie. You help people feel seen, heard, and valued. And I think we need more people like you out there, especially in our workforce and our organizations, to provide that psychological safety so that we're helping them through tough times and helping them get to the other side where we can all work together and create something great together. Thank you so much for joining me today and for having this conversation. This podcast is designed to help busy business leaders create an inspired and engaged workforce. I am building a community of like-minded leaders and experts who all share the same passion, taking care of people at work. Whether you are a blue-collar worker or a white-collar worker, small business owner or corporate executive, you belong in this community. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear more, please subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts. If you know someone who I should interview or should be part of this community, please connect with me on LinkedIn or Instagram. Life is too short. Let's take care of each other at work so that together we can make this world a better place.